Well, thanks, Georgette. Thanks, everyone, for allowing me to be a part of another Anglicans for Life. Man, it's a weird year to do it. It's strange to be doing it over video, although I guess we're all kind of used to it by now. I've done far more events this year over video than I have in person. But, you know, as I was thinking about kind of where we are and the title in particular of this presentation about what our pro-life convictions look like with a completely new political landscape than where we were just about a year ago, it made me think back, I think it was 2015, which was the first Anglicans for Life summit that I had the privilege to speak at, and I was there and as part of the whole March for Life. And there was a couple distinct things that I remember. The first thing I remember, of course, is the incredibly massive snowstorm that everyone was expecting, and that hit just as the march started. And as we ran through it, and I had my daughter with me, who was, I think, 10 or 11 at the time, and man, I grabbed her as soon as the march was over. We caught the last flight and escaped D.C. And anyone who didn't escape D.C. that year, right after the march, ended up being there till, I think, Wednesday because of the 26 or 27 inches of snow that came. I don't know if you remember that. It was intense. And it might have been a little bit of that snowstorm, or it might have been something else that kind of created the other condition that I remember, which is there was kind of a despair hanging over the March for Life that year. I remember there was a real sense, again, remember the time frame, this is 2015, January of 2015, if I'm remembering correctly. And there was really no sense that there was going to be any sort of respite coming from political sources in the coming year. It wasn't clear who the Republican nominee was going to be. It wasn't clear that the Republican nominee would have a chance against who was clearly, I think, already decided at that point as a Democratic frontrunner, Hillary Clinton. It wasn't clear who the frontrunner actually eventually became, that this person was really all that sincere in his pro-life convictions. There was a whole lot of things that were uncertain. And there was certainly a feeling of being a beleaguered minority in the American context. Because the policies, whether we're talking about domestic policies at the state level, we had states like California doing crazy things like trying to make pregnancy resource centers advertise for state abortion services and provide free transportation at universities for young women to get to abortion clinics, and all kinds of different crazy things that were happening at the state level. And we certainly had no sense that the future of something like the Supreme Court, which had held so much sway over what pro-life policies were going to be even allowed to stand at the state level, if any, going forward. I think that was probably about the time that the Texas law that dramatically reduced the number of abortion clinics in that state was overturned by a left-leaning Supreme Court. There was just so many details of that where it just felt like, look, man, the pro-life movement, if we're going to be about this, we're in it for the long haul. There's no kind of respite that we can expect coming from any sort of source. We're no closer to that finish line, whatever that finish line is, of an abortion-free America, I guess, than we were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. There was a real sense. And I think probably that impending snowstorm just kind of added to the intensity of what a lot of us were feeling going into that. And I remember one of the big themes that I spoke on for this summit and for some of the other events that I did around the March for Life had to do with this commitment to being people of hope. That to be a person of hope as a follower of Christ is not an optional thing. It's actually what Peter says defines people who believe in the resurrected Christ, that Christ is risen, therefore there's such a thing as hope. Or as Chuck Colson and Father Newhouse like to say, despair is a sin because Christ is risen. Now fast forward from 2015, just 1 year later, 2016, and I was back at the March for Life, and I spoke at another event. I'm not sure that was the year. I came back to Anglicans for Life one more time, and I'm losing kind of the chronology here, but I do remember the attitude and the spirit there was completely different. There was a lightness and an anticipation there was a feeling that the respite that was completely unexpected, from the political pressures at least, was here. There was a real hope that the Supreme Court might be remade. There was a real sense that a remade Supreme Court could let so many of these state policy initiatives that limited abortion access, or at least made women consider their decisions before just kind of running headlong into an abortion, that those things were maybe going to be allowed to stand. There was just, I think, the vice president, sitting vice president, showed up at the March for Life for the first time. My point is that 1 year, because of political changes, the entire attitude, the entire spirit of the week or the weekend completely changed. And I'm not here to say that it was completely unwarranted. By the way, if I remember right, 16 had a lot more sunshine than 15 did too. There was no 26 inches of snow that was barreling down and was going to shut Reagan Airport down for a couple days. I'm not trying to say that complete change in perspective, that complete change in posture, that complete change in attitude that I saw between 15 and 16 was unwarranted. Look, it would be foolish not to recognize the obvious, and that's this. Elections have consequences. Elections really matter. There is a completely different Supreme Court making decisions than was in place 4 years ago. That's obvious. That point is undeniable. Things have changed because of the change in presidency. And now, here we are, going into 2021, facing a change back. And many of us do remember, we're old enough to remember the last term of the Obama presidency, where an administration really drove home on both domestic and foreign policy fronts agenda items that had everything to do with either advancing abortion under the guise of women's reproductive health, or advancing a redefinition of marriage and sexuality under the LGBTQ agenda. I mean, it was a priority in education policy. It was a priority in foreign policy. It was these were priorities clearly for this administration, and we've got no reason to think that it won't be very similar under a President Biden as it was under that last term under a President Obama. We might have a different Supreme Court that's going to put checks and balances, and I would say even a completely remade judiciary top to bottom that's going to put checks and balances on this. So it does matter. Elections really do have consequences, and we are facing that. And look, so many of the changes in abortion funding, for example, the discretionary funding that comes from the executive branch, we saw President Trump cut that off. We'll likely see President Biden completely reverse that. The Mexico City policy, the most obvious example of whether, in the name of foreign policy, whether America will advance an abortion agenda or not. That's been a political football since the Reagan years. That's just going to go back and forth, and it will be reversed again under a President Biden unless something dramatic changes there. So that's what we can expect. But I guess the thing that I want to challenge the schizophrenia. I want to challenge the disorientation that so many pro-lifers have based on who is in the White House. I lead an organization called the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And as the president of that organization, I try to carry on as much as possible the work and legacy of a great leader of the last generation named Chuck Colson. And Chuck had a lot of things he liked to say. One of the things that he liked to say was, salvation will never come in Air Force One. And that's a very, very important thing to remember, that the most important part of our lives and work as individuals, as American citizens, are pre-political realities. Chuck also liked to say that politics is downstream from culture. I think that was absolutely true when he was writing and speaking and doing his work. When you go back, for example, to the push to legalize same-sex marriage, that was very much a cultural reality leading political decisions. And when we got same-sex marriage in popular culture and in education, and even in corporate America long before we got it in law, I think that's observably true. But one of the things that I think we need to check ourselves on, and one of the ways that I think things have changed from when Chuck Colson was writing and speaking, is that line that politics is downstream from culture. Now look, I agree completely that salvation will never come in Air Force One. I think, by the way, some of us probably need to be reminded that the Antichrist will never come in Air Force One either. At the same time, this idea that politics is always downstream from culture is not as true as it used to be. Now here's what I mean by that. We now live in a cultural moment where almost everything has been politicized, where almost all of our loyalties are vetted on political terms, not on moral terms, where our identity is politically determined, where so much oxygen and air in the room has been taken over by political leadership, by political forces, by political loyalties, by political parties. In other words, a whole lot more of our lives as citizens, as individuals, even as moms and dads, and church members even, has been sucked into this politicized vortex that characterizes 21st century, early 21st century American life. Now, even that in and of itself is something that's a reality that's downstream from some larger cultural realities, because there's all kinds of important pre-political realities that have long been a part of the American experience. Things like family and church and voluntary association, and even these pre-federal political realities like local politics and local governance and HOAs and the Boy Scouts and all that sort of stuff. And what we've seen over the last several decades is all those pre-political realities have been thinning out. They've become less and less important in our daily lives and experience. They've become far less formative over our lives. And the big, loud megaphone of what's coming out of D.C. has become more and more formative in our lives. And so really politics can't fill that vacuum if that vacuum isn't first created by the thinning out of some of these institutions. And so that's the world that we're walking into now. So not only are we walking into a changing political dynamic that we can look just 4 years prior and see how it changes us and see how it's going to change us again, or it threatens to change us again. Not only are we dealing with these changing kind of political realities, but we're now in a cultural moment where the cultural resources that we once had, that gave us stability, that gave us important information, that gave us our belonging, our sense of belonging and our loyalty, and even helped form our identity, those things are less and less important. And we're living in just a tremendously politicized time. That's the world that pro-lifers now enter. That's the world that pro-lifers now are called to do their work. Now, I bring all that up because we need to do some real hard thinking about what it means to be pro-lifers in two areas as we look at this kind of new political landscape. One is just how the landscape has changed, and that's what I just tried to describe to you, is all those kind of thinning out of pre-political realities and the remaking of culture around political loyalties, and that's only become worse than ever before. But the other thing that we need to decide is what exactly is going to ground our pro-life activities. What is going to ground our pro-life work? Because if we are just going to schizophrenically respond to the political environment, we're going to lose energy, we're going to lose commitment, we're going to lose effectiveness really fast. If we think that the future of this movement depends on an interpretation of this most recent election and whether it was stolen or whether it needs to be overturned, and if we think that that's really where our work lies, then we're going to run out of gas really quickly in this next year. And frankly, I'll just put it this way: we can't run out of gas in this movement. Too much is at stake. If I were to add one more element to understanding the cultural landscape, which again, remember, is one of the things I think we need to understand, it would be that all the pro-life challenges that we have faced for decades now, dealing with beginning of life issues, is just the beginning of the battle that we now face, not only with dealing with beginning of life issues, but also end of life issues. Look, maybe where we were on the abortion issue back in 1965, 1967, that's where we're at on the euthanasia question right now. And if Christians hadn't done a great job thinking through the ethical questions around the beginning of life back then, we've done a dreadful job thinking through the ethical considerations around the end of life. I'm really grateful, by the way, our friend Stephanie Gray, who's a Canadian pro-life apologist, a remarkable speaker. If you've never seen her work, you can Google her, and again, her name's Stephanie Gray. She has also just written a tremendous new book, and apparently Amazon is having a hard time figuring out some technical glitches to actually sell it. I'm sure that's a coincidence. But Stephanie Gray has a book about end-of-life issues and about the question of doctor-assisted death, euthanasia, and so on. This is something that is taking so many countries around the world by storm. And we've seen where it lands in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and other places. Right now, it's interesting. There are doctors in the UK that are liberal in every other sense of that word, who are fighting against the legalization of doctor-assisted suicide or euthanasia and the advancement of that, because they say, and I'm telling you what they say, it's impossible to limit. It's impossible to control. You say that there are safeguards, you say that there are restrictions, you say that there are lines that we can draw, but those lines never hold. Those lines never stick. And that's coming from those who have no reason, ethically, at least in terms of any sort of first principles, to oppose doctor-assisted suicide or to oppose euthanasia. They're doing it out of a pragmatic concern. Essentially, we can't stop it. I'm just telling you, that's where we're headed. And we can't lose gas in our attempts to uphold the dignity of life, to protect the sacred unborn. Because if we fail to protect the sacred unborn, we're not going to have any resources whatsoever to protect the elderly, the disabled, those who are particularly vulnerable in our community in a middle of a health crisis with limited resources and limited money. So the question is, what are we going to ground our pro-life activities in? What are we going to ground our pro-life convictions? What's going to be solid enough? What's going to be unshakable enough that can actually ground us so that we don't run out of gas in the challenging days ahead? Clearly, there are going to be challenging days ahead, but we've got to do something that keeps us away from this sort of schizophrenia of hope and despair based on whoever is in the office, because literally lives are at stake. Let me give you an illustration about what I mean by this. A couple months ago, I say a couple months ago, good heavens, I guess it's been over a year because it was a live event and I haven't done a live event in so long. I was in Florida speaking to a group of grandparents. They asked me to help them translate the culture of their grandchildren to them. And a couple hundred people in the room, all in a retirement community down there. It was a really fascinating event. And I asked, believe it or not, who the oldest person was in the room. Now, there were some elderly folks in this room, honestly. And so the guy who won the prize was, I think, 96, if I remember correctly. And this guy was a large, solid man, grizzly old veteran sort of guy with the hat on and everything. And we just started to talk, and it was just remarkable as we reflected as a room what this guy had seen in his lifetime. And then we backed it up a generation. And we said, hey, I asked him, do you know when your parents were born? And he knew. And he knew when his parents were born. And so that puts us back into the latter part of the 1800s, I guess, at this point, maybe mid-1800s. And I asked him a question. I said, can you imagine your parents sitting you down? And we did the math, and I guess we were somewhere around 1920 or something like that. I said, can you imagine your dad sitting you down somewhere around 1920 and saying, hey, son, this is what you're going to face in your lifetime. This is what you're going to face, and here's all the decisions you're going to have to make, and here are the right decisions for you to make. And he just laughed because it was a ridiculous conversation. Can you imagine in the 1920s really making any predictions about, for example, the next decade, the scope and the depth and the length of the Depression, or the following decade, which had to do with the growth of global fascism and Nazism, and taking the whole world to the brink of destruction, and then talk about brink of destruction, the Cold War, and the threat of mutual destruction, and then leading into that into the 60s. And so the sexual revolution, feminism, the rock and roll revolution, the space race. I mean, this is what this guy had seen in his lifetime. It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable what this guy had seen. And to think that his parents could sit him down and prepare him for all that was laughable. We do a weekly podcast on our podcast. I actually do a daily podcast called Breakpoint, but we do a weekly conversation. We just did kind of an intro to the year. And we started to think about, we were trying to make some predictions about 2021 and the issues that Christians were going to have to care about. And we started to laugh at ourselves because even trying to figure out what 2020 would hold in store a year ago would have been a ridiculous and futile exercise and pointlessness, right? Because who could know all that stuff that was going to face not only America, but the whole world in 2020. But that's my point. Look, we don't know. We don't know what we're going to face. We don't know what new technology is going to emerge, like CRISPR, that's going to create ethical challenges around the beginning of life, not just in the taking of life, but in the remaking of life, the genetic remaking of life. We don't have any idea about another global pandemic where the numbers might be even far worse than COVID, where we now have to make financial decisions around who is valuable, who is not. I mean, good heavens, clearly we didn't have any sort of ethical preparation for deciding who gets the vaccine and who doesn't, or who gets first treatment or preference on ventilator. I mean, all of this stuff was stuff we completely muddled through. I mean, just go back to the headlines and the stories about Italy in the early days of this pandemic, and you'll see that when the cultural pressures jump in, it reveals so much more. I've actually started calling this, and I've done a series over the past year, and you can find it on our podcast and on our website, which is at breakpoint.org, on what we call pre-existing conditions to COVID. Just like we know there were comorbidities physically that made the impact of COVID far worse for some than for others, our point was there were comorbidities culturally that weren't created by COVID, but were exposed and escalated and worsened by COVID that are very serious. For example, we're now seeing the number of suicides and suicidal ideations went through the roof for particular segments of the population during lockdowns. These aren't issues caused by COVID. These are issues worsened by COVID. My point is there's no way to predict the sort of pressure that's going to come on pro-lifers, on the pro-life position, on pro-life laws, and even, if we're honest, on the pro-life courts, even in the year ahead, not to mention the next 3 or the next 4 or the next 8, depending on what happens. There's no way to know that. So how do we survive? How do we prepare for it? The parents of this 96-year-old man wouldn't prepare him well by sitting down and trying to predict everything that was coming. The parents of this 96-year-old man would prepare him best by teaching him not what he was going to face, but the sort of person that he needed to be no matter what he faced. That's why I ask, where are we going to get our convictions? If our convictions are somehow grounded in the fact that we're going to win. I've heard too many pro-lifers, for example, say, the goal is to overturn Roe v. Wade. Look, if Roe v. Wade gets overturned by this court in the next few months, which isn't going to happen, but let's say that it does, you know what that means? That means state-level pro-life initiatives have just become more important than ever. Because the best we're going to get from the court, by and large, is sending it back to a state's decision and giving states the right to limit abortion access and giving states the right to regulate both pro-life and pro-abortion organizations and all that sort of stuff. It's going to be a state. You know what that means? That means state-level activism is far more important than ever before. And you know what that means? That means the pro-life movement not only continues, that means the call for everyday individual Christians to jump in and to continue to put their blood, sweat, and tears in this movement continues. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't change at all. Right? The key question for pro-lifers is, who are we going to be? Are we committed to this not because we thought we were going to win under the last president? Are we going to lose our commitment because somehow we think we're going to politically lose under this president? Or are we committed to this because of what we know to be true? And we know it to be true because it is revealed in Holy Scripture. And it has long been the stance of the church, from the very beginning of the church, that every single person is made in the image and in the likeness of God, which means their dignity and their worth and their value is not dependent on what they look like. It's not dependent on how big they are. It's not even dependent on their location, whether they're in this room or this state or that state or in this country or that country or in this womb or outside of that womb. It's not dependent on how developed we are, whether we're taller, whether we're smarter, whether we have more physical capacity, more physical abilities or mental abilities. It's not dependent on how dependent we are on anybody else, whether we are self-sufficient or whether we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps or whether we can take care of our own. No, human dignity, human value, human worth is that which has been given. It's not what we earn. It's that which has been given to each and every person because God has given them, endowed them with His image. God created a lot of things. He only created one thing that bears His image. And that means that every single life has value, has dignity, has worth, from the moment of conception unto the moment of natural death. If there is anything else, now I'm not saying, look, our strategies don't change. Of course our strategies change. Our strategies better change right now. There is a difference between making, hay while the sun is, that was a farmer analogy that went right out the window. There's a difference between moving forward when you have the ability and being wise and so on. I understand all the strategic decisions that need to be made, but our commitment cannot waver. Our hope in the fact that ultimately the risen Christ will make all things new. And we are part of that renewing, restoring agenda that God has for His world. And that's where our hope lies. It's not in winning the last election and getting a particular political calculation achieved because of that. It's in the fact that we belong to the family of the Creator, who in Christ is going to make all things new and allows us to be a part of that with Him. That's what we've got to know. Every Christian, no matter what cultural setting they're in, no matter what particular cultural challenges they face. This includes, for example, our brothers and sisters. My home church is part of a diocese in the Anglican Church that comes out of Nigeria. The questions that they're having to answer, the decisions that they're having to make about their faith and what's going to ground their faithfulness to Christ is the cultural pressure there at the hands of Boko Haram and the Fulani militant herdsmen and so on is unbelievable. Unbelievable. Last year was the worst year on record for Christian persecution around the world, and Nigeria was one of the worst spots. They have to make some decisions. So they have to decide. Is it going to be a temporal vision of whether we're going to win or whether this is short-lived or where? No, it's got to be grounded only in the risen Christ. It's no different for those of us that have committed ourselves, our fortunes, our honor, our duty to the defense of the unborn. Thank you so much.